There's a lot of global economic uncertainty right now, ever since Trump launched Liberation Day, where he threatened to slap 46% and 49% tariffs on Cambodia and Vietnam, as well as high tariffs on Europe and Mexico. The whole world is concerned, is the United States a stable and trusted trading partner still? And the answer is no. So recently, Xi Jinping, the president of China, made a visit to Vietnam, Cambodia, and Malaysia, and really won because he showed the world that China is the adult in the room. Unlike President Trump, who changes his minds on whether to slap tariffs or exempt countries or to pull back tariffs completely, the free trade and the winner of this is China, because China is trying to show the world that it is the responsible partner that wants to push free trade. Now, in the United States, a lot of people think that China is nervous about the trade war and is going to kneel down and fold and give in to all of Trump's demands. That's just not going to happen. I want to remind my fellow Americans of one word, and that's the R word, or resolve. Right now, Xi Jinping and the Chinese people are coalescing together. They're not scared about the United States. They're going to push back really hard. You have to remember 2 points. First, is China underwent a century of humiliation at the American and European colonial powers when they forced China to open up their borders to sell opium and to pay huge taxes to the Western colonial powers. Because of this, China suffered for 100 years before the rise of the CPC in 1949. So Xi Jinping and the Chinese people are resolved not to give in a second time to imperial powers. They're going to push back a lot harder than most Americans think. The second thing is, Chinese can eat bitter a lot more than Americans. You have to think, even Xi Jinping himself lived in a cave for many, many years during the Cultural Revolution. He knows what it's like to endure hardship. When I first moved to China in 1997, many Chinese people that I spoke to told me they could only eat meat once every month or two. So they are resolved to go through years, decades even, to push back against Americans. While in the United States, you've already seen Trump fold and has given exemptions to iPhones and PCs and other categories because of internal pressure from the United States. You're already seeing Americans are complaining about the trade war. Farmers are saying, we can't sell our soybeans to China anymore. We need to have subsidies. So to my fellow Americans, we are not going to win this trade war easily because China has the resolve. Now, when Xi Jinping went to ASEAN to visit Malaysia, Cambodia, and Vietnam, what's really important to note is that the president of Vietnam met President Xi at the airport. The Prime Minister of Malaysia met President Xi at the airport, and the King of Cambodia met President Xi at the airport. It's very clear that ASEAN wants to get closer to China's economic orbit. And this is a win for China because ASEAN accounts for about 16% of overall trade. Now, in 2017, America accounted for 18% of overall exports for China. That number is down to around 14%. So basically, over the last 7 or 8 years, China has de-risked from the United States and has pushed more to grow their trade routes into the global south, or what I prefer to call the global majority. And it's important because Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim of Malaysia said this week that China always treats Malaysians as equals and has very good relations. So it's not going to be an easy win for Trump's tariffs and trade war. Scott Bessent, the US Treasury Secretary, says that China isn't holding the cards and is going to fold quickly. Now, on a slight personal anecdote, I've actually advised Scott in the past when he was still at Soros Investment Management and he was investing in China. He has been negative and bearish on China for 12, 13 years ever since I met him. Basically, his view of analyzing the Chinese equity markets was it's a communist country. Thus, from an ideological standpoint, China will fail. Well, obviously, in the last dozen years since I advised Scott, China's economy and political system has grown. So Scott was not looking at data, was not looking at facts about China's strength then, and he's not looking at facts and strengths now. Again, China is using the R word, or resolve. And the people of China, the CPC and Xi Jinping himself are all coalescing together and pushing back hard against the United States. And they're going to be able to do that because they have good trade and good political relations with countries in ASEAN and throughout the entire world. Well, nobody wins in a trade war. Let me be clear on that. American consumers are losing because they have to pay more when they go into a Walmart or shop on Amazon, and the Chinese don't win. You're seeing a lot of the low light industry, like in apparel, gadgets, and toys, are getting hit hard in southern China in a city called Panyu. And a lot of these small companies that generate 50 to 100,000 US a year in revenue are actually shutting up shop as larger players in Vietnam and Cambodia try to get around America's tariffs. So in a trade war, no one wins in the short term. But in the medium to long term, China's actually the winner here. In the last week and a half, I've been outside of China, I've been to Thailand, and I've been to Belgium. And even in Belgium, the seat of the European Union, where Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the EU, for years has talked about decoupling or de-risking from China, and she's known as one of the largest China hawks in Europe. She recently said, we can no longer trust the United States, and we need to pivot back towards stronger relations with China. So in the short term, everybody's hurting. In the medium to long term, if Trump continues this tariff war, the United States is shooting itself in the foot because the American consumer is going to have to spend about $3,000 to $4,000 US dollars more per person to buy products. You're also seeing a lot of anger coming from Europe and Asia, not just in China. The number of European tourists to the United States dropped 10-12% in March of this year. And Goldman Sachs estimates that America is going to lose 90 billion US dollars in tourism related spending from Europe in 2025 at the current trajectory. You're also seeing a lot of international students aren't willing to go to the United States to study right now. Over 1,000 international students have been deported from the United States for, one, supporting Palestine in the Palestine-Israel war, and then two, for very minor infractions. There's horror stories of international students being deported and having their visas canceled because they got a speeding ticket or a second speeding ticket, 5-10 years ago. So right now, the whole world is looking at the Trump regime and the United States with disbelief. They think things are crazy in America. And so in the medium to long term, where else are they going to find economic growth? And that's going to be China. So the big winner of the first 80 days of Trump's administration is China, because they're seen as the stable, trusted trade partner. And so they're doing more deals with ASEAN. They're doing more deals with Europe. It's really a shame for the United States. And I hope that Trump fires his advisors like Scott Bessent, Peter Navarro, and Howard Lutnick, who are pushing for tariffs, and he takes a more free market, free trade view, because it's free trade that over the last 40 years has really uplifted billions of people out of poverty. And it's been the US-led world economic system since the end of World War II that has benefited the United States. What Trump is doing now, threatening our allies, threatening our adversaries, is just doing damage to the United States. For instance, we can look. China is no longer buying American beef. They're buying beef from Australia. China is no longer buying oil from the United States. They're now buying oil from Canada. China is no longer buying American soybeans. They're now buying soybeans from Brazil. China is no longer buying Boeing airplanes. Xiamen Airlines actually just refused to accept a Boeing airplane that had just arrived in China. They're now instead buying Airbuses from France, or they're expanding Comac, the Chinese indigenous homegrown domestic airplane brand, which they just signed a deal to sell several Comacs to Malaysia. So what's happening is the entire world's system is shifting. China can basically buy everything that America sells, except for semiconductors, from other countries. The United States can only buy antibiotics, refined rare earth, iPhones, computers from China. And that's why China right now has the upper hand in the trade war. But don't get me wrong. This is definitely going to bring pain to the Chinese economically. You're already seeing scores of cheap manufacturing of cheap goods in southern China are already closing shop, and they're relocating to Vietnam and Cambodia. And let me also be clear, they're moving to cheaper destinations. They're not going to bring jobs or manufacturing back to the United States. It's just not going to happen. America doesn't have the manufacturing ecosystem, workers, land, laws that help promote strong manufacturing. You're already seeing TSMC, Taiwan's big semiconductor company, has spent billions of dollars trying to build semiconductor factories in Arizona, and they've had huge problems from a human resource standpoint, from a quality control standpoint, and from a regulatory standpoint, even though this was supposed to be Joe Biden's baby. So it's a pipe dream, to use a word that Janet Yellen, the former US Secretary of Treasury, said. It's a pipe dream to bring all this manufacturing back to the United States. It's much better for China to make what it's good at and the United States to make what they're good at. And looking at physical good trade deficits really just doesn't make sense, especially because the numbers that Trump looks at doesn't take into account service sector. Where in the service sector, where it's software, internet services, movies, law, or finance, is something that America dominates in. So in the short term, everybody's a loser. Medium to long term, China's the winner.